Have you ever ignored something your heart was telling you to pay attention to? Because this is the story of a man who almost made that mistake, and what he discovered will make you rethink every small decision you make every day. Stop asking questions. That's exactly what they told David Martinez when he picked up that forgotten box from the darkest corner of the Milwaukee post office depot. It was a Tuesday, around 11 o'clock at night, and that mysterious package had been abandoned. There for over 6 months. No clear sender, no complete recipient, just a handwritten address scribbled in shaky handwriting that was barely legible. The brown tape was cracked with age, the yellowed cardboard covered in a thin layer of dust that told the story of its abandonment. When David mentioned to his colleagues on shift that he was thinking about opening that box, laughter echoed through the empty warehouse. "Forget it, David. It'll cause trouble. That thing's already marked for auction. It's not worth getting involved." But something about that forgotten package deeply bothered the mailman. It was as if the box was calling out to him, begging not to be ignored, not to become just another lost item in the system. Have you ever felt that? That inexplicable feeling that you need to do something, even when everyone around you says otherwise? David felt it. And on that lonely night, under the cold fluorescent light of the warehouse, he made a decision that went against all the rules of the post office. With trembling hands, he tore the old adhesive tape. The sound echoed in the deafening silence, and when he finally opened the worn cardboard flaps and looked inside, his hands trembled even more. What David saw in that moment would change not only his own life, but the destiny of dozens of people he didn't even know. Stay with me until the end, because this is the true story of an ordinary mailman who disobeyed the rules and discovered a secret buried for 30 years, a secret that no one should know but that everyone needed to discover. And what began as a simple curiosity in a quiet Milwaukee warehouse turned into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. Because sometimes the most important deliveries aren't in the packages that arrive on time. Before I tell you what was inside that box, I need to tell you something. If this story is already affecting you, if in some way you're feeling that tightness in your chest, that feeling that this has to do with your own life, I want to ask you a favor. Leave a like on this video now, seriously, because stories like this, real stories about ordinary people who make extraordinary choices, need to be shared. They need to reach more people. And it's your like, your comment, your subscription to this channel that makes that happen. I know this topic resonates with you. I know why you've come this far, why you're still with me. So tell me in the comments below, have you ever ignored a calling from your heart? Have you ever let an opportunity to make a difference pass you by because of fear, laziness, or simply because someone said, "Forget about it"? I want to hear your story. I want to create a community here of people who believe that small actions can change entire lives. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button now. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Real, moving. Stories that remind us of the goodness that still exists in the world. Because when you subscribe, when you like, when you comment, you're not just helping the channel. You're saying, "Yes, I believe these stories matter. I want more of this in my life." And that, my friend, has immense power. Now come back with me to that quiet warehouse in Milwaukee. David just opened the box. His hands are trembling. And what he's seeing inside will break your heart. And at the same time, fill you with a hope you didn't even know you needed to feel. Inside that box were letters, dozens of them. Envelopes yellowed with age, tied with a faded red string that seemed to have been carefully chosen decades ago. But these were no ordinary letters. Each envelope bore a different name handwritten in delicate, trembling calligraphy. For Sarah, for Thomas, for my son, James. And deep inside, as if guarding the most precious secret of all, was an old black and white photograph. The image showed a smiling woman holding a baby in her arms, with that hopeful look that only someone who truly loves can convey. On the back of the photo, also handwritten, was Eleanor Thompson, 1967. David felt a shiver run down his spine. These weren't just forgotten letters in a dusty warehouse. They were vivid memories. They were words that someone needed immense courage to write. They were pieces of an entire life waiting for 3 decades to finally reach their destination. And there he was, David Martinez, 52 years old, 28 years of dedicated service to the United States Postal Service, holding in his hands something that completely transcended any protocol or regulation he had learned throughout his career. Because David wasn't just any mailman, he was one of those invisible employees who keep the world's gears turning without ever receiving the spotlight, punctual as a Swiss watch, discreet as a shadow, efficient to the point that his superiors didn't even remember he existed most days. He worked alone on the night shift at the Milwaukee, Wisconsin distribution center, where thousands and thousands of packages passed through his tired hands every week. While the city slept, David organized, sorted and directed dreams wrapped in brown paper and tape. But there was something different about him, something his co-workers couldn't quite understand. David had a heart as big as the world. For him, each box that passed through his hands wasn't just an object to be processed and sent on. Each package carried unseen stories. It carried birthdays, reconciliations, carefully planned surprises, life-changing news, memories being sent across miles. He always went out of his way to deliver every package, even those considered impossible by others, even the most confusing addresses, the most difficult recipients to locate. David didn't give up easily. And it was precisely this way of being, this mentality that every delivery matters, that led him to that mysterious box on the forgotten shelf of unclaimed items. That box that was there, covered in layers of dust and indifference, ignored by everyone rushing past on their hurried shifts. A box that carried the weight of abandonment, but at the same time seemed to silently cry out for attention. Waiting. Always waiting for someone who cared enough to stop and ask, what if these words are important? What if someone is still waiting for them? That night, under the cold light of the empty tank, David made a decision that would change everything. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to embark on a journey that would reveal hidden truths, reconnect shattered lives, and prove that sometimes the simplest decisions can have the most profound impact. Because this wasn't just the story of a mailman opening a forbidden box. It was the story of how the courage of one ordinary person can rewrite the destiny of many others. But before we get there, you need to understand who Eleanor Thompson was, because without knowing the woman behind those letters, you'll never grasp the magnitude of what David was about to discover. David couldn't sleep that night. He arrived home as the sun was beginning to rise, but his mind remained trapped in that cold, silent warehouse, the letters, the handwritten names. Eleanor Thompson holding that baby in the 1967 photograph. Who were Sarah, Thomas, and James? Why did those words never reach their destination? And more importantly, why had no one ever claimed that package? The lack of answers consumed him like a slow-burning fire that wouldn't go out. The next day, even exhausted and operating on autopilot, David began his own private investigation. He sat down in front of the old computer in the Milwaukee Public Library and typed the full name into the search engines. Eleanor Thompson. The screen loaded slowly, displaying thousands of generic results that led nowhere. Common surnames are a curse when you're looking for someone specific, he tried adding the city, the street, any fragment of information that could narrow the search. Nothing. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of the entire country. But David had something most people have lost in this fast-paced digital world. He had old-fashioned persistence. So he got in his car and drove to Maple Street, number 847. The address existed. The house was there, a silent witness to decades of history. But what David found broke a piece of his heart. Boards nailed to the windows, peeling paint on the walls, a lawn overgrown with tall grass that no one had cut in years, and hanging on the front door, swaying slightly in the cold afternoon wind, a yellow demolition notice scheduled for next month. Eleanor no longer lived there. Perhaps she would never live anywhere again. David felt the weight of this revelation tighten his chest, but he hadn't come all this way to give up so easily. He knocked on the door of the house next door. A lady with white hair and tired eyes opened the door suspiciously. When David explained that he was looking for information about Eleanor Thompson, the woman's face softened a little. "Ah, Eleanor," she said in that tone of voice that carries both longing and sadness. "She lived here in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. A quiet woman, always alone. I think she went to a nursing home at some point. We never heard from her again." That small piece of information was like lighting a candle in complete darkness. David returned to the library with a new purpose burning within him. He began to sift through public records, old newspaper archives, forgotten obituaries in the digital depths of local history. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after opening that forbidden box, he found it. A small news item published in the local newspaper in September 1995. The words were few, but each one carried the weight of an entire life, reduced to a few impersonal lines. Eleanor Thompson, 76 years old, passed away peacefully at the Valle Verde nursing home. She left no known relatives. Private funeral. She left no known relatives. Those 5 words echoed in David's mind like a stifled scream. Eleanor died alone, no family around, no one to hold her hand in her final moments, no one to mourn at her funeral. And now, there in the trembling hands of a curious postman, were her last desperate attempts to change that story. Letters addressed to Sarah, Thomas, James. People who should have been there. People she loved enough to write to even as her body was failing. David felt a fierce determination take hold of every cell of his being. Those letters couldn't die with Eleanor. Not after waiting 30 years in silence. Not when there was still a chance, however small, that the people whose names were written on those yellowed envelopes were still alive. That they could still know they were loved. That they could still receive the forgiveness or the words Eleanor never managed to say in person. But finding these people would be like finding Eleanor had been. Difficult, almost impossible, and completely necessary. Because sometimes the most important journey isn't the easiest. It's the one you simply can't abandon, no matter how many obstacles appear along the way. If you've been following this story this far, if you're feeling what I'm feeling as I tell you this, then subscribe to the channel now, because you're part of this community of people who still believe that stories like this need to be told. That lives like Eleanor and David's matter. And now comes the part that will leave you breathless, because when David finally opened those letters and began to read what was written inside, David knew he was about to cross a line he shouldn't. Sitting alone in that empty warehouse, with only the distant hum of fluorescent lights for company, he looked at the yellowed envelopes in his hands and made a decision that would change everything. Technically, opening someone else's mail was against all the rules. Technically, he could be fired, but technically those letters were already doomed to oblivion, destined to turn to ashes or be auctioned off as worthless curiosities to strangers who would never know the truth hidden behind those words. With the moral permission that only his own heart could give, David carefully untied the faded red string. The knot was tight, strong, as if Eleanor had tied those letters together with the last of her strength, ensuring they would stay together no matter what. When the string finally gave way, David felt as if he were opening an emotional time capsule, a direct portal to the innermost thoughts of a woman the world had already forgotten. She picked up the first envelope. "For Sarah, my granddaughter I never met." The words written on the front were enough to make her heart race. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and began to read. The handwriting was delicate but uneven, showing the struggle of arthritic fingers desperately trying to record thoughts before it was too late. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "I know you don't know who I am. I know your mother never spoke of me, and I deserve this silence. But I need you to know that the mistake was never yours. The mistake was mine." Eleanor wrote about an old family feud, about prejudices she carried for years that destroyed her relationship with her own daughter, about how she rejected her daughter's marriage to a man she deemed unworthy, about how she cut ties and let pride speak louder than love, and about how decades later, when illness was already robbing her of her strength and regret, burned hotter than any physical pain, she discovered she had a granddaughter, a girl who grew up never knowing she had a grandmother who, despite all her mistakes, would have given anything for a second chance. David had to stop reading. He wiped away the tears that threatened to blur his vision. He took a deep breath. and continued. He picked up the second letter. To Thomas, my brother. The revelation here was different but equally devastating. Eleanor was asking for forgiveness for having distanced herself after Thomas became ill, for having let fear and shame speak louder than blood loyalty, for never having visited, for never having called, for having allowed years to turn into decades of absolute silence between two siblings who were once inseparable. And then came the hardest letter of all. To James, my son. David felt the weight of those words even before opening the envelope. A son. Eleanor had a son. And here she was, writing from her deathbed, begging for his forgiveness. The letter revealed the inner workings of a family shattered by unmet expectations, by harsh words spoken in moments of anger, by doors slammed shut that never opened again. Eleanor wrote about how she had been too harsh, too demanding, too critical, about how James left home at 18 and never returned, about how she waited for years for him to call, to show up, to give her a chance to start over, and about how, when she finally mustered the courage to look for him, it was too late. Pride had built walls that seemed insurmountable. Each letter was dated, all written between 1994 and 1995, the last months of Eleanor's life. She had used her last strength not to write a will of material possessions, but a will of love, regret, and desperate hope for reconciliation. She had prepared that package with meticulous care, addressing it to herself on Maple Street, perhaps planning that someone would find it after she was gone, and do what she lacked the courage or health to do herself. But something went wrong. Maybe she forgot to mail it. Maybe she died before completing the plan. Maybe the package got lost in the chaotic postal system of that time. No one would ever know for sure. What mattered now was that 30 years later, those words had finally found someone willing to listen to them. And David, holding those letters against his chest, felt the weight of a responsibility that transcended any job description or procedures manual. Those weren't just letters. They were the last attempts of a soul seeking redemption. They were bridges not built, conversations not held, hugs not given. They were living proof that regret knows no expiration date, and that love, even imperfect and late, still deserves a chance to be given. But here comes the question David couldn't stop asking himself. Were Sarah, Thomas and James still alive? Was it possible after 3 decades? David knew he had only one option: to do what Eleanor couldn't do, to deliver those letters personally. But how could he find 3 people whose only traces were handwritten names on envelopes from 30 years ago? The task seemed impossible, but David had already proven that impossible was just a word people give up questioning. He had the full names on the letters: Sarah Thompson Miller, Thomas Thompson, James Thompson. He had fragments of information scattered across the yellowed pages. Mentions of cities, dates, small details that Eleanor had let slip while pouring her heart out on paper. Armed with these crumbs of information and a determination bordering on obsession, David plunged into the depths of modern social networks. Facebook became his best friend. He typed Sarah Thompson Miller, and the screen exploded with dozens of profiles. But he had something most amateur investigators don't: patience. He began examining each profile, looking for clues. Approximate age, location, family connections visible in the photos. And then, after hours that turned into days, he found it. A profile of a woman in her 50s living in Chicago. The profile picture showed someone with features that mysteriously echoed those in Eleanor's old photograph. The same eyes, the same hesitant smile. David sent a message. His hands trembled as he typed. How do you explain to a complete stranger that you have a letter from a grandmother she's never met? How do you reopen a wound she may not even know existed? He opted for the straightforward, simple truth. He explained who he was, where he worked, how he found the package, and he attached a photo of the letter addressed to her. He pressed send and waited. The wait was agonizing. Hours dragged on like days, and then his phone vibrated. Sarah's reply was short, but full of emotion, even through the cold screen. Oh my God! Is it real? My grandmother tried to... Contact me? The conversation that followed lasted for hours. Sarah told her story, how she grew up hearing only silence when she asked about her mother's family, how her mother had died young, taking with her all the secrets about Eleanor, how Sarah had always felt an inexplicable emptiness, a missing piece in the puzzle of her own identity. And now, decades later, here was the answer. Her grandmother didn't hate her. Her grandmother loved her. Her grandmother had regretted it. David sent photos of every page of the letter. On the other end of the phone line, Sarah cried. She cried for the grandmother she never knew. She cried for the conversations that never happened. She cried for the instant transformation of her own personal narrative. Encouraged by his success, David set out to find Thomas. But here the journey took a darker turn. Public records showed that Thomas Thompson had passed away in 2003. Another chapter closed before redemption could arrive. But Thomas had left. Behind a daughter, Monica Thompson, still living in Milwaukee, just a few miles from where Eleanor spent her final days. David found her through property records and social media. He called her directly this time, his confidence growing with each step of this impossible mission that was becoming possible. Monica answered hesitantly, but when David explained about the letters, about Eleanor, about a woman's last plea for reconciliation to her brother, Monica was silent for long seconds. Finally, her voice breaking, she said, "My father spoke of her sometimes, always with sadness. He never got over the estrangement. He died still hoping she would make contact." David felt the weight of this revelation. Thomas had died without knowing that Eleanor had tried, without knowing that she regretted it. But Monica could know. Monica could carry this message of belated love as an emotional inheritance her father never received. And then came the biggest challenge, James, the son. David searched. Everywhere. Social media, voter registration records, public databases, genealogy websites. Nothing. James Thompson was too common a name, and the man seemed to have completely disappeared from the radar. Until David had an idea. In her letters, Eleanor mentioned that James had always loved nature, that he had talked about moving to the Northwest. David began searching in Oregon and Washington, and there, hidden in a small Facebook group about organic gardening, he found him, James Thompson. 68 years old, living in Portland, Oregon. The photo showed a gray-haired man, a tired smile, holding a potted plant. David took a deep breath and made the most difficult call of all. When James answered, David didn't know where to begin. "Mr. Thompson, my name is David Martinez. I work at the Milwaukee post office, and I have a letter for you. From your mother, Eleanor Thompson." The silence on the other end was so profound that David thought the call had dropped. Then a hoarse, broken voice replied, "My mother died 30 years ago. How could you possibly have a letter from her?" David explained everything. And when he finished, James was openly crying. If this story is affecting you as much as it affected me, subscribe to the channel now. Because what's going to happen next is something you won't want to miss. It's about the power of second chances that come when we least expect them. Because David didn't just stop at finding these people, he had an even bolder idea. David's idea was simple yet profoundly powerful. Why simply send the letters through the mail when he could do something more meaningful? These people weren't just recipients of overdue mail. They were fragments of the same shattered story. They were cousins who never met. They were an uncle and niece separated by decades of silence. They were pieces of a family that Eleanor had desperately tried to reunite in her final breaths. And now, 30 years later, David had the chance to finish what she started. He proposed a meeting. A single moment where Sarah, Monica, and James could come together in person, where they could read the letters together, where they could finally fill in the empty spaces of their own stories with the truths Eleanor left behind. The initial reaction was hesitation. James especially resisted. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he confessed over the phone, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of unprocessed hurt. "My mother hurt me deeply. I've built an entire life away from those memories." David didn't press him. He simply said with the gentleness of someone who understands that true transformation cannot be forced, "I understand, Mr. Thompson. But your mother wrote those words when she was dying. And perhaps, just perhaps, there's something in them that you need to hear. Not for her, for yourself. There was a long silence. Then James agreed. I'll go, but I promise nothing more than to show up. Sarah was more enthusiastic. She saw this as a chance to finally meet the family she had been denied her all her life. I'm taking my daughter, she said. She's 8 years old. I want her to know where we came from. I want her to know this part of our history. Monica, Thomas's daughter, also agreed to participate. She brought with her old photographs of her father, memories preserved in dusty albums that had never been shared with anyone outside the small remaining family circle. David arranged the meeting for a Saturday morning at a cozy coffee shop in downtown Milwaukee. He arrived early, carrying the original box with all the letters neatly arranged. His heart was racing. He was just a mailman. He had no training in family therapy or conflict mediation. But he had something perhaps more important. He had the absolute conviction that this moment needed to happen. Sarah arrived first, nervous, holding her young daughter's hand. Monica appeared soon after, carrying a folder full of old photographs and documents. And then, just as David was beginning to fear that James had given up, the door to the coffee shop opened and a grey-haired man slowly entered. His eyes scanned the room until they found David. And then they found Sarah and Monica, and something changed in his face. An expression that mixed fear, curiosity, and a fragile hope he probably hadn't felt in decades. The initial introductions were awkward and emotional. Sarah and James looked at each other as if they were seeing ghosts of themselves. You have her eyes, James said softly, referring to Eleanor. I saw her in old photos. Monica showed pictures of Thomas, and James touched the photographs with trembling fingers. My brother, he whispered. He looked so much like our father. Sarah's daughter observed everything with that quiet wisdom that children sometimes possess, realizing she was witnessing something important, even without fully understanding the emotional undercurrents. Then David placed the letters on the table. 3 yellowed. Envelopes that carried decades of unspoken words. Each of you has your own, he said gently. Eleanor wrote to each of you, and I think the time has come for you to finally hear what she had to say. Sarah picked up her letter first. Her hands trembled so much that she could barely open the envelope. When she began to read aloud, her voice faltered several times. Eleanor's words were raw and honest, asking forgiveness for having rejected her own daughter's marriage, for having let prejudice speak louder than love, for having missed the chance to meet the granddaughter who was now reading her words. Monica read the letter addressed to Thomas on behalf of her deceased father. It was a reconciliation that never came in time, words from a sister who regretted abandoning her brother when he needed her most. Tears streamed freely down Monica's face as she read, imagining how different things would have been if her father had received those words before he died. And then it was James's turn. He held the envelope for long minutes before opening it, and when he finally read his mother's words, something broke inside him. When James finished reading, he didn't say anything. He simply placed the letter on the table. James placed the letter on the table and covered his face with his hands. His shoulders trembled with silent sobs that came from a place so deep it seemed to have been kept there for a lifetime. Sarah instinctively reached out and touched his arm. This uncle she never knew she had until a few days ago. Monica also approached, forming an impromptu circle of connection around this man who was finally allowing decades of pain to surface. When James finally managed to speak, his words came out broken, but laden with a truth he had never admitted to anyone, perhaps not even to himself. I spent 40 years believing she didn't love me, he said, wiping his eyes with trembling hands. I built my entire identity on that story. The rejected son, the man who wasn't good enough for his own mother. And now I find out that she spent the last months of her life begging for my forgiveness, trying to reach me, telling me that the mistake was hers, not mine. Eleanor's letter to James was brutally honest. She didn't try to justify or minimize the mistakes she made. She acknowledged that she was a harsh, critical, impossible to satisfy mother. She admitted that she placed overwhelming expectations on the shoulders of a boy who only wanted to be loved, unconditionally. She confessed that when James left home on that rainy night in 1977, she stood at the window waiting for him to return. And she kept waiting, for years, for decades. But pride prevented her from going after him. The fear of rejection paralyzed her, and when she finally mustered the courage, when illness forced her to confront her own mortality, she wrote those words that now, 30 years later, were completely transforming the narrative James had carried his entire life. Sarah picked up the old photograph of Eleanor that David had brought and placed it in the center of the table. Everyone looked silently at the smiling young woman, holding a baby in her arms. "Is that you?" Sarah asked James softly. He took the photo and studied it for a long moment. "I think so," he replied hoarsely. "I've never seen this picture before. She looks so happy." And there was the most painful revelation of all. Eleanor had been happy once. She had been a young mother full of hopes and dreams. But something along the way had broken. Perhaps her own unhealed wounds. Perhaps unrealistic expectations inherited from a previous generation. And these internal fractures ended up creating fractures in the entire family. Monica began sharing the photos she had brought of her father, Thomas. There was one in particular that caught everyone's attention. A young Thomas, perhaps in his early 20s, next to a woman who was clearly Eleanor and a small boy who could only be James. Sister, brother, nephew, united in an image frozen in time before everything fell apart. James touched the photo as if he were touching something sacred. "I remember that day," he whispered. "It was Uncle Thomas's birthday. I must have been about 6 years old. It was one of the last good days I remember us having together." Sarah's young daughter, who had remained quiet the entire time, absorbing everything with her large, attentive eyes, suddenly asked, with that devastating innocence, "Only children possess? Why is everyone sad if you're together now?" The simple question echoed across the table, and it was true. There they were, 3 generations of a family that had been torn apart by pride, hurt, and unspoken words. But now, gathered around yellowed letters and old photographs, they were finally having the chance to rewrite the ending of their story. David watched everything from a discreet distance, his own tears flowing freely. He had only delivered overdue mail. But what he was, witnessing was much greater than that. It was living proof that it's never too late for healing. It's never too late for forgiveness. It's never too late for connection. Even when the person who initiated that journey of reconciliation is no longer here to see the impact of their words. Sarah was the first to break the reflective silence. "Do you know what this means?" she said, looking between James and Monica. "It means we're family. That my daughter has a great uncle and a second cousin. That we're not alone in this world like we thought we were." James looked at the girl and something changed in his eyes. Perhaps for the first time in decades, he saw possibility instead of loss. He saw the future instead of just the past. If you've been following this story this far, if you're feeling every word as I'm feeling it as I tell you, then subscribe to the channel now. Because you're part of this journey, and what will happen next will prove that a person's legacy goes far beyond the time they spend on this earth. Because it was at that moment, watching that family reconnect before his eyes, that James made a decision no one expected. James took a deep breath and did something that surprised everyone, including probably himself. He looked directly at Sarah and said in a firm but emotional voice, "I want to meet my great niece. I want her to know who I am, and I want to make up for all the time I wasted being too stubborn and proud to back down." Then he turned to Monica and continued, "And you're my brother's daughter. I should have been there when he died. I should have been there during his life. But I can't change the past. I can only try to do things differently from now on." It was at that moment that something extraordinary happened. Sarah's little daughter, with that innocent wisdom that defies all adult logic, stood up from her chair, walked over to James, and simply hugged him. Without words, without hesitation. Just a pure and genuine hug from a child who doesn't carry the weight of old grievances. James froze for a second, as if he had forgotten how to receive unconditional affection. And then his arms enveloped the girl, and he cried in a way he probably hadn't cried since childhood. He cried for the mother he lost, for the wasted time, for the family he almost never knew, and for the unexpected grace of a second chance. Sarah joined the embrace, then Monica, and there, in that ordinary Milwaukee coffee shop on a Saturday morning. That began like any other for the other customers drinking coffee, oblivious to the miracle unfolding just a few feet away. An entire family was rebuilt upon the rubble of decades of separation. David watched from afar, discreetly wiping away his own tears, knowing he was witnessing something that completely transcended his small decision to open a forgotten box. The hours that followed were filled with stories. James recounted his life in Oregon, how he built a solitary but functional existence, always with a hole in his chest that he tried to ignore. Sarah shared memories of her mother, Eleanor's daughter, who died young without ever having the chance to reconcile with her own mother. Monica brought up memories of her father Thomas, painting a portrait of a kind man who carried the sorrow of losing his sister until the end of his days. And Sarah's daughter, absorbing everything with that emotional sponge that children are, began to ask questions that forced the adults to articulate truths they might never have verbalized before. "Why was Grandma Eleanor angry with Mommy's mommy?" the little girl asked, referring to Eleanor's daughter, whom Sarah had never met except through stories. Sarah explained as best she could to an 8-year-old. She talked about how sometimes people let fear and prejudice speak louder than love, how Eleanor had been raised in a different time with strict rules about who you could love and what your family should look like, and how, when her daughter chose a different path, Eleanor lacked the emotional flexibility to accept it. James completed the explanation in a way that revealed a great deal of hard-won self-awareness gained over decades of therapy and solitary reflection. "Your great-grandmother Eleanor was hurt when she was young," he told the girl gently, "and hurt people sometimes hurt the people they love. Not because they want to, but because they don't know how to do otherwise. I did the same thing. I spent so much time angry that I forgot how to let people get close to me." The girl looked at him with those big eyes and asked with devastating sincerity, "And now do you know?" James smiled through his tears. "I'm learning," he replied. "You're teaching me." David realized it was time to step back and let that family find their own way. But before he could quietly leave, Sarah called him back. "Wait," she said, standing up quickly. "You can't leave without us thanking you. Do you know what you did here? Today, you didn't just deliver letters. You gave us back something we thought was lost forever. You gave us family." James nodded vigorously. "I would have died without ever knowing my mother regretted it, without ever knowing she loved me. You gave me peace, man. I don't know how to thank you for that." David, being the humble and discreet man he always was, simply said, "I just did my job, deliver mail." But everyone at that table knew it was much more than that. It was about choosing to see beyond protocol. It was about recognizing that some deliveries are worth any risk. It was about believing that human connections matter more than any regulation or convenience. Because when the story of Eleanor and the forgotten letters began to spread, something unexpected happened. Sarah posted a photo of that encounter on social media. It wasn't anything elaborate, just a simple image of the letters on the coffee shop table with a heartfelt caption summarizing the story of how a mail carrier had reunited a broken family through correspondence forgotten for 30 years. She expected nothing more than perhaps a few likes from close friends. But the internet has a mysterious way of amplifying stories that touch on universal wounds we all carry. Within 48 hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. People from all over the country began commenting, many of them openly crying as they typed about their own regrets, their own broken families, their own unspoken words that weighed like stones on their chests. A local Milwaukee newspaper contacted them, wanting to do a story, then a television station. And then, like an unstoppable wave of genuine human interest, the story spread to national media outlets. David suddenly found himself at the center of attention he never asked for and certainly didn't expect. Reporters were calling the post office depot wanting to interview him. His supervisor, the same one who had said never mind that fateful night, was now proudly telling everyone that he always knew David was an exceptional employee. The irony didn't escape David's notice, but he was too humble to point out the hypocrisy. Instead, he used every interview, every opportunity to speak, to direct the attention back to where it really mattered. To Eleanor, to the courage she had to write those letters even knowing it might be too late. To Sarah, James, and Monica, who had the vulnerability to open their hearts to strangers who shared their blood. But the most profound impact didn't come from media coverage. It came from ordinary people who began to act, inspired by the story. David started receiving letters at the post office depot. Hundreds of them. People telling their own stories of reconciliation that Eleanor's story had sparked. A 60-year-old man who hadn't spoken to his brother in 15 years because of a disputed inheritance wrote a letter of apology after reading about James. A woman who had cut ties with her parents decades ago because of whom she chose to love, made the connection she had been postponing for 20 years. Entire families began healing processes because they saw it was possible. Because they witnessed that it's never too late while there's still breath in your lungs and courage in your heart. Sarah, James, and Monica also began receiving messages, people thanking them for sharing their vulnerability publicly, for showing that real transformation is messy, painful, and beautiful at the same time. James, in particular, was touched by messages from other men his age who carried similar hurts, who had built emotional fortresses around old wounds and were now considering, for the first time in decades, the possibility of letting those defenses fall. Sarah's daughter, that 8-year-old girl who had embraced James so naturally, unknowingly became an ambassador of hope. Sarah shared how her daughter now understood that family is more than just the people you see every day. It's connection. It's shared history. It's choosing to love despite imperfections and mistakes, and that understanding, planted so young, would likely shape how she navigated her own relationships for the rest of her life. Eleanor never met her great-granddaughter in life, but she was teaching her powerful lessons decades after her death. David returned to work the night shift as usual, but now, every time he saw a package on the unclaimed shelf, he stopped. He looked closer. He inquired about the story, because he had learned a lesson that fundamentally changed his mindset about the work he did. Each box was a life. Each address was a hope. Each late delivery was a potential opportunity to change destinies. He began investigating more forgotten packages. He no longer found emotional treasures like Eleanor's letters, but he found other kinds of impact. Birthday presents that never arrived, important documents someone was desperately waiting for, small things that meant worlds to specific people. His colleagues, who had previously laughed at him, now observed him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Some even began to imitate him, paying closer attention to detail, asking questions about problematic packages instead of simply marking them as undeliverable. The entire warehouse culture began to subtly shift, because a person who chooses to see value where others see only inconvenience can create waves of transformation that reach far beyond their individual actions. If you've stayed with me this far feeling every word of this journey, subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this need to be told, they need to be remembered, they need to inspire more people to make their own courageous choices. And now we arrive at the final moment. The moment where we discover the true legacy, not only of Eleanor, but of everyone involved in this extraordinary story. 6 months after that meeting at the coffee shop, something extraordinary happened. Sarah, James, and Monica organized a small ceremony at the cemetery where Eleanor was buried. It was a sunny Saturday, the kind of day that seems to bless important events with its golden light. They brought fresh flowers, the original box that had held the letters for so many years, and something else. Sarah's daughter had made a drawing at school showing a family tree. On the trunk was written Eleanor Thompson, and the branches extended, showing all the connections that now existed thanks to her courage in writing those letters. David was invited to participate, and for the first time since it all began, he visited the grave of the woman he never met personally, but who had changed his life in ways he was still processing. The gravestone was simple, unadorned, just her name, her birth and death dates, and nothing more. But now, around that cold stone, was an entire family, alive, connected, growing. James knelt beside the grave and placed his hand on the grass. "Thank you, Mum," he said simply, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I had given up on you." Sarah read Eleanor's letter aloud again, but this time not just to herself. She read it to the grandmother she never knew, to the other cemetery visitors who happened to be nearby and stopped to listen, to the entire universe that needed to be reminded that belated love is still love. Monica shared memories of her father, telling Eleanor through words that floated in the air like a prayer that Thomas had died peacefully, that he had been a good man, that he would have forgiven his sister if he had had the chance. And then Sarah's daughter, with that inexplicable wisdom that children sometimes possess, placed the family tree drawing on the tombstone and said something that made all the adults present freeze. "Grandma Eleanor, you're not alone anymore. We're here, and we'll always be." It was a simple promise from an 8-year-old, but it carried the weight of a generational transformation. The cycle of abandonment and resentment that had defined that family for decades was finally being broken. David watched everything from a few feet behind, giving the family space for their private moment. But Sarah turned and motioned for him to come closer. "You're part of this story too," she said firmly. "You need to be here too." Then David joined the circle, and for the first time allowed himself to truly feel the magnitude of what he had done, not with pride, but with a deep gratitude for having been the instrument through which something so beautiful could happen. After the ceremony, the group went for coffee together, a tradition they had established. They met once a month now. James had even started traveling from Oregon to Milwaukee more often, reconnecting with the city where he grew up and with the people who now formed his extended family. Monica was planning a trip to Portland to visit James and see the life he had built there. Sarah and her daughter had spent Christmas with James and Monica for the first time, creating new memories that would sustain future generations. But perhaps the most profound impact wasn't visible in grand gestures or emotional encounters. It was in the small, daily decisions that each of them now made differently. James called Sarah every week simply to talk. Monica had begun writing letters to her own children, documenting things she wanted them to know in case something happened to her. Sarah had reached out to people in her life with whom she had lost contact and was trying to rebuild bridges she herself had burned years ago. And David, well, David remained David. He worked his night shift at the Milwaukee post office depot as he always had. But now he carried with him a hidden truth that completely transformed how he viewed his work. Each package had a story. Each address was a hope. Each delivery was a chance to make a difference in someone's life, even if he never knew the full impact of his actions. He had learned that heroism doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes it's just the silent decision to care when it would be easier not to care. And now, we've reached the end. But this ending is actually an invitation for you to write the next chapter. So that's it. The story of the postman who disobeyed the rules and changed lives. The story of Eleanor, who wrote letters with the last of her strength. The story of a family that reunited 30 years later. But you know what's most important? This could also be your story, because the truth is we all have our own forgotten boxes, words we need to say, people we need to forgive, connections we let die because we thought it was too late, or because pride got the better of us. And the lesson Eleanor, David, Sarah, James, and Monica left us is simple. It's never too late. As long as you're still breathing, as long as the people you love are still around, there's still time. If you've stayed with me this far, until the end of this whole journey, leave a comment saying I'm with you until the end. I want to know that this story touched you as much as it touched me while I was telling it to you. And if it made you think of someone specific, of some unspoken word you carry in your heart, tell me about that too. Sometimes we just need a little push to find the courage. And of course, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Because here we tell real stories of ordinary people who make extraordinary choices. Stories that remind you that kindness still exists, that transformation is possible, that you are not alone on this journey of trying to be a better person. Leave a like too, because that helps more people find this kind of content. And honestly, if this story touched you, it will touch other people too. And the more people know that there is still hope, the better this world becomes. There's a video over here that continues this conversation about second chances and lost connections. Click and join me. There, because we still have a lot to talk about regarding the power of small decisions. Thank you for staying until the end. Really. See you in the next video.